And welcome to my YouTube channel, Nady the Coder. Today in this lecture we're going to be talking about object references and copying. We're going to be talking about what are object references, how they are stored in the memory, and how we can copy one object from one variable to another variable. So in the previous lecture we talked about objects and how we can create objects and how we can different properties to objects, how we can remove properties from objects and all that. So before diving into this lecture, please make sure that you watch the previous videos and lectures on JavaScript and then objects in order to follow the tutorial. So yeah, let's just dive into the lecture. One of the fundamental differences of objects versus primitives is that objects are stored and copied by reference, whereas primitive values are always copied as a whole value. So what does it mean? For example, we have two variables over here and we assign a value to a message variable and then copy or assign this message variable to the praise variable. Let's see what happens now. Let's say we have a variable called message and we assign it a value. And then we have, for example, another variable that's called praise. We assign it another variable praise, and let's print out the values. After assigning the value, we'll print them, for example, message and then praise. And as expected, we'll see hello, hello. So you can see that we have two times hello printed out because the first time the value is coming from message itself, but then it's copied to or assigned to the praise variable, and now I'm printing the praise variable as well. So I'm expecting two times hellos over here. What happens now if I modify, for example, the message variable and change it to, for example, world? So if I save it and refresh, you can see the changes only occurs in the message variable, and it's not being reflected in the praise variable. So this is how the primitive data types work. Let's have a look into a quick diagram and see. So for example, if I create a message variable and then I have a praise variable and I have the same value that has been copied to, for example, this variable to the praise variable, then it's been they create a separate copy of the hello variable two times. So it's not just the same copy or same value they are these variables are referencing to. So if I make a change into the message, or even if I make a change into the praise value, it will not be reflected in the other variable, even if we are copying one value from another and we are seeing some kind of dependency over there. So this is how basically primitives works in JavaScript. But objects are not like that. A variable assigned to an object stores not the object itself, but its address and memory. In other words, a reference to it. With the help of diagram, let's just understand it and see how it really works. So for example, we have a variable called user, and then we assign it an object. So basically the drawer represents an object, and the name is basically a property that we are storing on that object. So when we assign this object to a variable called user, then what happens is it does not assign directly the object value to the user variable. Instead, it just copies the memory address. So whatever address this whatever memory address this where this object is stored on, it will be assigned or assigned to the user variable over here. Or in simple words, we can say that the user variable will reference this object in the memory. For example, we have a variable called user, and then we have an object created, and let's say we assign it a value, for example, name, and we assign it a value called Jackson Dent. So yeah, the object is stored somewhere in the memory, while the user variable has a reference to it. So that's how we define it in simple words. When we perform actions with the object, for example, take a property user.name, the JavaScript engine looks at what's at the address and performs the operation on the actual object. So when an object variable is copied, reference is copied, but the object itself is not duplicated. For example, let's say we have another variable called admin, and we copy the value of this user. So basically we are saying that we are copying the value of the user object, and this is how it should look like. And we can still console log, and as expected we will see 2 times this object. You can see we have name Jackson 2 times because the user and admin objects have the same values. But that's not actually the case. It's as if we had a cabinet with 2 keys, for example, and we used one of them as an admin, for example, and to get into it and make some changes into the cabinet. And then we later on use another key, for example, it's called the user key, and we are still opening the same cabinet and then can access the changed contents, basically. For example, we have the user variable over here. It's basically referencing one object in the memory, and then an admin, and if we make a copy of the user object and assign it to an admin variable, then they both are referencing the same object in the memory. So if I make a change through the user object and this object, then the admin variable will see the reflected changes in here as well. And for the sake of understanding, we can reference the same object but as many as variable as we want. Let's take a look at an example and see how it really looks. So let's say we had this object over here. It has a single property called name, and then admin is basically accessing the same variable. Let's say we now make a change, for example, user.name equal to hello world. Let's just assume that this is the name. And now what happens is, unlike the primitive data types that we saw, that when we made a change on the user variable, it wasn't reflected by the second variable. But let's see how it works here. When we refresh the page, you can see name is hello world and name is hello world. So this is basically what I mean by referencing the same object by different variables. So the user object or the user variable has a reference to the same object as the admin. So making change to this object by any of the through any of the variable will make change to the actual object in the memory. So this is how objects are different than primitive data types in JavaScript. Comparison by reference. 2 objects are equal only if they are the same objects. For example, we have 2 objects over here, and they will be the same if they are the same objects. What does it mean? So for example, let's say we have a user variable and it is referencing an object in the memory, and we then there is another admin variable that is referencing the same variable in the memory. So if we compare these 2 variables, for example, then it will be true because they're referencing the same object. So that is the only case that we have. So 2 objects will be equal only if they are the same object. Or in simple words, we can say if they are referencing the same object. 2 independent objects are not equal even though they look alike. For example, we have 2 variables with these 2 objects. Even they're empty, they look alike, they're the same. But since they are referring to different objects in the memory, so that they're not equal. Now we'll talk about cloning and merging different objects. So copying an object variable creates one more reference to the same object. If you want to copy for example, an object to another variable, so it will create a separate reference to this object, to the same object, as we've seen here. So copying this user object into an admin variable, it will create another new reference to the object and will not create a duplicate of the object. So what if we want to create a duplicate of that? Okay, we can create a new object and replicate the structure of the existing one by iterating over its properties and copying them on the primitive level. So that is one case. This is how we can do it. So basically we can make use of loops in order to copy one object into another. So it will create a separate object with all of those properties and will be copied onto another variable, and then we can have separate objects and we'll have access to those. So let's just take look into an example. For example, we have this over here, and what we want to do is let's say we have an admin object over here, and I want to make or loop through the user object over here. Then what I can do is I can loop through this using the for in loop, and I can say for key and user, that's basically the object, and I want to assign it to the admin object. So I can simply do admin dot key equal to user key. So basically whatever is the value on user and the key, user.key, basically I'll assign it to admin.key. So it will create a separate copy of the object and it will assign it to the admin user and we can have access to it. Let's see how it looks. So now you can see we have two different objects now. What if I make a change in one object? Would it be reflected in this other one? Let's take a look. For example, I want to make the user.name hello world, and I'll just get rid of this and see. You see, so now since we have created a separate copy of the same object, so now I made the changes on the user object, but it's not reflected on the admin object because they are now two separate objects. So this is how we can create a copy of the same object from another. We can also make use of native built-in function that is called object.assign. It has different arguments. So the first argument is dist, which is basically the target object. So basically we initialize it with an empty object, or for example, if we have an existing object and we copy some values or properties from another object to this one, we can make use of the object.assign function. And source 1 up to source n are the source objects from where the properties will be copied into the target object. If the property already exists on the target object, then it gets overridden. So you can see over here we've been looping through the user object in order to copy all of the values into the admin object, but most of the time this won't be the case. So we can make use of the object.assign function over here. And what we can do is we can specify the target object, the destination object, and then that whichever object we want to make copy of. So for example, we are taking the user object and copying it to an empty object. All of the properties, take all of the properties from the user object and put it in this empty object and assign it to the admin variable. And now we when we print them, and we'll see when we refresh it, you can see two different objects with the same properties. What happens now if I modify again the user object? So when I refresh it and see, you can see that the user object is modified, the name properties of the user object is modified, but not the admin object because they're now two separate variables. So that's how we can create or clone an object in JavaScript. Another way of creating clone or copying an object from one variable to another, we can make use of a spread operator. We will explain more and talk about more the spread operator in the upcoming lectures, but for now we can just create the object literals and make use of the dot operators over here. That is called the spread operator, and we can assign or specify the name of the object that we want to copy into this one, and I'll put it here. And when I save it, I'll refresh and you can see the same results over here. What if I don't modify the value and just let it be like that, and I refresh the page? You can see we're seeing the same two objects, but they are basically two different objects created, or one is being cloned from another one. So this is how we can create different clones with using the spread operator. Nested cloning. So until now, we assume that all properties of user are primitive, but properties can be references to other objects as well. Let's assume that we have an object over here, and it has, for example, let's say address property. The user has some name, and then it has an address. So an object property can reference to another object as well. So what happens over here? As for example, let's say the city could be anything. I'll put, for example, ABC. All right, and then I can put the country, for example, and I can say 1, 2, 3. So this is basically the address of this one. So what happens now? Does it refer to the same object. If I make changes for example the user dot address dot city, for example, I change it to hello world, would it be reflected in the object admin object or not? So if I go to this and check the city and this user object, you can see it's been modified. What happens if I open this one and see? So it has been modified over here as well. So this is another problem of copying the nested objects. So basically the address is the nested object that is still referring to the same object. So these two address properties are referring to the same nested objects. So that is basically the problem, and we don't have any native function for that to clone deeply the parent objects. For that, we make use of the Lodash library, and we can make use of deep cloning and all that. We will look into that in the upcoming lectures. So yeah, this is basically the end of the lecture. I hope you have learned something new in this video about the object references and what is the difference between the primitive data types and object data types, and how we store them in the memory, how they make references to different objects. So please like and share the video, subscribe to the channel, make sure to press the bell icon for future updates, and until then, I'll see you in the next lecture.